Hello, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, episode 181. If you're a returning viewer, thanks for coming back. And if you're a new viewer, I'll explain the channel briefly, and hopefully you'll decide to stick around for a bit. Behind me, and then over to the right, my right, not your right, not that it matters. Anyway, this is all my Sega collection. I grew up being a fan of the 8 and 16-bit era of Sega, and as I got older, thanks to the internet and magazines like Retro Gamer, I realized that not only were there tons of games that I didn't have a chance to experience when they were new, but there were also many games that I didn't even know about, either just due to being obscure releases or not being released in North America at all. At the same time, I tend to watch YouTube channels about collecting, and invariably, there's tons of stuff out there about people that collect for a Nintendo, but not so much Sega for whatever reason. And for the few people that do actively collect for Sega, like say your John Hancocks of the world, they only concentrate on North American sets, ignoring the literally hundreds of European releases out there that are totally playable. Look, I may not be able to read Japanese, surprise, surprise, so those games are sort of out of the question, but believe it or not, the occasional extra U in a word is not going to throw me. So I decided to do something that I think is somewhat unique and create a YouTube channel where I collect and review every English language game for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And then take a look at not just the game, but the physical package as well, since I am going through the trouble of collecting these things after all. Also, I try to churn these out every week or so when possible, because otherwise I'll be dead long before getting to the end of this list. Okay, enough about all that. I think you get the idea. Assuming that you are still here, let's get started with what's going to be the last review of 2022, and consequently the last review of year 4 of this channel. Because it's the last review of the year, and since I had an open slot in the schedule, I thought I'd pick something that I've been curious to take a look at for a long time. And it's something that's unique in the Sega Genesis library. And that game is Bimini Run, released by Nuvision Entertainment in either late 1990 or early 1991. The internet can't seem to agree about this one. But the ROM build date is from April of 1990, so I'm going to assume that it's earlier rather than later, as I doubt Nuvision just sat on it for a year before getting it out. Now, you may be thinking, I've never heard of Nuvision Entertainment. And there's a very good reason for that, as Bimini Run is the only game ever produced by Nuvision before the company shuttered for good a few years later. Apparently, Nuvision had plans for 3 other titles. First, Beanball Benny, a bizarre action game where you get to be a cab driver that fought crime by throwing baseballs, and I swear I'm not making that up. Then, there was supposed to be a game based on the Guardian Angels, the essentially good guy gang that patrols various major cities, who I actually know from the time period in the mid-90s when wrestler Ray Traylor, aka the Big Boss Man, had a gimmick change and was a member of the Guardian Angels for a while. Finally, Nuvision had a game based on the DC Comics character Swamp Thing planned, and it actually got pretty close, and a prototype of the game is out there floating around if you're interested. Today, however, we are just talking about things that actually exist, which means Bimini Run. I'm excited to check this out, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Bimini Run for the Genesis. I think I picked this one up a few years ago off of eBay because I don't ever remember seeing it in person. Maybe once, but it's definitely an uncommon game. It is out there though, if you're interested, and not terribly expensive, with complete copies currently going for between $35 and $50. This copy in particular is in pretty decent shape, with one caveat. The hang tab at the top has been somewhat roughly removed, but the rest of the outer cover looks great, with no scratching, rips, or nicks present. Unfortunately, and this is where the caveat comes in, you can probably tell by looking at the inner cover that we're dealing with possibly some sun bleaching here. It's not horrible, and I've seen way worse, but comparing to pictures I've seen of other copies, the colors just seem muted, and they don't pop quite the way they're supposed to.
At the same time, though, it's kind of odd. Rather than sun bleaching, the cover almost seems to be the victim of a misprint, due to the fact that there seems to be a lack of green coloring. Not sure what's up with that, and I wasn't aware that sun bleaching could somehow remove an entire color. But if you look at parts of the boat, the water, and even this box on the back that was originally green, it's now clearly blue. Weird. Anyway, moving on, the cover art itself is pretty cool and definitely unique on the console. The colorful cigarette-style speedboat driven by the heroes is clearly in the middle of combat with other boats and a helicopter, and it's hard to look at this and not get a Miami Vice feel, which I'm sure is what the designers were partially going for, as the show had only finished its initial TV run just the year before. I also like how, even though this was a third-party release, they still went with a cross-hatched background, but unlike the plain black and white that you're used to, Nuvision laid out their logo graphic in a bunch of tiles to give the design their own spin. Flipping over the back, and it's more custom layouts with their own 1 to 2 player graphic at the top, and then 4 decent quality screenshots at the bottom, with one being enlarged. While the pictures themselves look fine, I do think they probably could have had a little more variety, as the 3 of them look almost identical unless you look closely, and I find it funny that in all 3 of them, the driver of the boat is turning right. Seems like an odd coincidence. The flavor text lays out the basic plot of the game, where you're playing as Kenji Ohara, who's apparently a Asian, Irish, whatever. He's a self-made adventurer whose twin sister, Kim, has been kidnapped by the evil Dr. Orca. Yes, the bad guy is named after a killer whale. I really hope that they're better at programming than naming characters. Anyway, the flavor text is decent, but this one section kind of caught my eye. But the real test of nerve is the Bimini Zone, the ghoulish warp in time where nothing is quite as it seems. Apparently, this fictitious Bimini Zone is the game's stand-in for the Bermuda Triangle, so I had to check, and indeed, the real-life Bimini area of the Bahamas is part of the Bermuda Triangle, so at least they got that right. Opening up the box, and we've got the cartridge and manual, with the manual being in good condition, with just some minor wear. I've got to say, for a company that only ever released one game, this manual is solid. The pictures that are included look great, and everything is diagrammed well, so you can easily figure out what's going on. There's also plenty of story exposition with backgrounds for the various characters and enemies, and then towards the end are summaries for each of the 6 levels as well. You might be able to figure out Bimini Run on your own, as the controls aren't very complex, but this is one of those games where I feel like you're definitely missing something without the manual. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and try to take down Dr. Orca and his BAM technology to save the world. I touched a bit on the overall plot of the game in the last section where I was looking at the rear of the package, but just to be clear, Bimini Run is the story of main character Kenji Ohara, whose twin sister Kim has been kidnapped by the evil Dr. Orca. Why this occurs isn't really explained, but apparently Kenji is some sort of self-styled adventurer, and his exploits have caused him to investigate Dr. Orca's nefarious deeds, which has led to the abduction. Kenji, like any good action hero, is the owner of a high-powered speedboat known as the Banshee, which is convenient because Dr. Orca is operating in and around the Bimini Islands of the Bahamas, so clearly he needs a boat to go after him. But piloting a speedboat in the Atlantic Ocean is no small task, so to assist Kenji, his friend Luca steps in to handle all of Kenji's artillery needs. Also, Luca is such a cool weapons expert that he has no last name. He's simply just Luca, in a sidekick trope if there ever was one. All kidding aside, Luca isn't just present to give the game a buddy action movie feel, as his presence is used to explain the 2-player setup of the game. In single-player mode, Player 1 handles all of the shooting and piloting of the Banshee, with level shots being aimed straight ahead of the boat, and the computer assists the players with auto-aiming at aerial targets like helicopters. But in 2-player mode, Player 1 takes control of Kenji to pilot the boat, and Player 2 takes control of Luca and aiming any firing of the guns. I'm not sure that 2-player mode necessarily works any better than single-player mode, but it's nice to at least have the option, and it reminds me a bit of the arcade machine Lucky and Wild, which has a similar option for 2 players. Once the game begins, that buddy action movie feel that I referred to isn't just limited to the plot of the 2 guys going up against some big bad while also needing to rescue a damsel in distress. The way the game's level structure is set up supports that comparison as well, and if it's not patterned after a full-length feature, it definitely feels like a special 2-part episode of your favorite hour-long TV show, like Magnum P.I. or perhaps the too obvious Miami Vice. The game consists of 6 levels, and each level feels like it's an act of a production, with every level having a clear, different story objective to accomplish. It's not simply shoot bad guys for 6 levels. I mean, it is, but just go with me here. The first level is almost shockingly short, but does serve as a good introduction to the story and the gameplay, and it even has a cinematic intro showing Kenji and Luca running on the dock to jump into the Banshee and tear off after a boat that they think is piloted by Kim's kidnappers. You don't find Kim, naturally, because the princess is in another castle, but Luca does get access to some better weapons that you utilize for the rest of the game. This feels like that first 5 minutes of a movie or TV show when they try to rope you in quickly with some action piece right off the start. Then, each of the following levels has a more standard length, and while some of the action can be considered repetitive, I think there's more than enough differences to keep things interesting, and again, act as their own section of the story. For instance, all the levels can be sort of sorted into 2 different types: chase levels and search and destroy levels. The odd levels, 1, 3, and 5, are all levels where the main purpose of the level is to chase something in the Banshee, with the first level having you chase down the fake kidnappers, the third level having you chase down the real kidnapper, Dr. Orca, and his yacht, and the 5th level having you chase a mermaid. More on that in a minute, but like I said, they did try to mix things up a little. Then, for the even levels, you're having to search all of the islands in the area to find your sister and Dr. Orca. And this is done by visiting the various islands and destroying towers on those islands. And yes, these even levels could definitely be considered more repetitive than the odd levels, but level 4 takes place at night, giving the game a different look and making the hunting for the towers more difficult until you get close. And then level 6 has the enemy intensity ramped up, as you would expect for a final level, so even though you're technically doing the same types of things on those levels, they each have a different feel. The reason why I'm stressing the fact that the levels have an individual feel is because one of the complaints that I saw online about the game is how repetitive it is. And to be fair to those complaints, I can easily see why someone would say that. For levels 2, 3, 4, and 6, you're primarily going to be doing 2 things: checking your map and shooting enemy speedboats and helicopters. And then for the even levels, you can throw in taking out radar towers as well. However, I do feel like the levels are short enough to where, sure, while the in-game action might be repetitive, it's not like they just go on and on and on like they do in some games, and even though you might be completing similar tasks, you still have to be on your toes constantly because enemies can come from all over to attack you as you're navigating from island to island. And then there's that level 5. The premise for level 5 is that after you had managed to rescue Kim the previous night, during level 4, now all that's left is to take out Dr. Orca himself, but he's managed to escape to a secret island lair that's hidden in the Bimini Zone, which is apparently being masked by some sort of cloud machine that he has set up. To make your way through the Bimini Zone to disable the cloud machine, what do you think you have to do? To use radar to ping your way through the clouds? Or maybe get some air-based assistance from your friends that leads you through the fog? No, you'll never guess, so I'll just go ahead and tell you. To reach your destination level 5, you have to follow a mermaid. And no, I'm not joking. To make it to the island with the cloud machine, you have to follow the siren song of a mermaid, Marlina. And I'm saying Marlina and not Marlena because it's spelled with a Y, while being carefully to not accidentally shoot her as sharks, giant squid, dragons, and mutated manta rays take turns trying to attack you. Level 5 is like if Kenji and Luca were celebrating after rescuing Dr. Kim, and they accidentally took acid before going back on the hunt for Dr. Orca. And to tell the truth, I kinda love it. It's just such an unexpected bananas level in the proceedings, and sure, technically all you're doing is the same thing you've been doing by following something in your boat and shooting enemies, but due to the different enemies in Marlina, it just feels like you're temporarily transitioned into a different game. The best way I can kind of describe it is possibly the hidden Wolfenstein level in Doom 2, but this isn't a secret, it's right there in the game. I'm not sure who on the design team had the bright idea to add this in to mix things up, but I think it was a fantastic idea, and I'm glad that they rolled with it. Okay, now that I've thoroughly described what you'll expect as far as level structure go, how does the game actually play? Honestly, especially for the era with it being an early Genesis title, I think it plays pretty well. The Banshee is responsive in turning, and I like how the throttle reflects a normal boat throttle, with you just setting how far open it is and not having to hold down an acceleration button instead of just using up and down on the D-pad to control how open that throttle is. Then there's the shooting, which works great in one-player mode, with the A button being used for your bazooka, which is useful for taking out the towers on land, and then B and C being used for your machine gun to attack either water or air-based enemies. I especially like that the air attacks are auto-aimed by the computer in one player, so when a helicopter, or perhaps one of the flying monsters, shows up, all you have to do is hit the button to take them out, while you watch them either explode or very satisfyingly spin into the ocean. However, even with the aerial aiming assistance, Bimini Run is tough, there's no getting around that. But it's not impossible, especially if you drop the difficulty down to easy, which not only makes the enemies not quite the sharpshooters that they are in the more difficult settings, but also shortens the levels by giving you fewer targets on the map in certain cases. There's no denying that the enemies can be frustratingly good shots, but I didn't come away thinking that the game was completely unfair, because in most of those cases, if you're smart about how you take evasive action, you can avoid being shot. I think that the game actually provides a decent level of challenge, and the developers added in options for how many boats you start with, along with an assortment of continues to help you make your way through the game. I was particularly impressed with the graphics in Bimini Run. Keep in mind that this is a game from a small third-party developer that never produced another game, for a console that had only been out for about a year in the United States, and it's housed inside of just 4 megabits of ROM. The engine moves well, and the enemies zip around the screen with gunfire in a pseudo 3D presentation, and the background is a combination of some very nice ocean animations along with a sky that changes colors depending on the time of day and the weather. For when it was released, I honestly think it was pretty advanced, and while you certainly can't put it in the same class of something like a Doom or a Duke Nukem 3D, something about the way you move about the level while taking on the enemies gives off that same type of essence of first-person shooter. The sound in Bimini Run isn't quite as impressive as the graphics, but it's still decent. The keyboard intro during the title screen definitely gives off Miami Vice vibes, and the in-game tracks are of similar quality and composition, but I'd say they're a bit more subdued. Instead, the game appears to emphasize the sound effects over the music, which makes sense due to all the action that's going on. There's tons of explosions and gunfire, and of course the ominous whoop 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 overhead when helicopters are chasing you down. Out of all the sounds in the game though, there's one I've got to call out, and that's the "Come in, Kenji" speech that plays each time your console has a mission status update. The sound effect is great, very clear, and sounds like it's broadcast over a radio frequency, but you're gonna hear it a lot. And I don't want to complain because having an audio cue that your mission objectives have been changed is a good thing, but maybe they could have recorded a few different takes to mix it up a bit. Just a thought. When I first popped in Bimini Run, I really had no idea what to expect. Sure, I'd looked at the package and seen some screenshots which appeared to show the action, but I also had read the manual, and with as detailed as the manual is about the game, it makes the game seem a bit intimidating. Thankfully, that's just Nuvision thoroughly explaining what really ends up being a relatively simple action shooter with a few bells and whistles. I won't lie, at first Bimini Run was slightly frustrating due to the one-hit kills and how good the computer's aim can be. But once I kicked the difficulty down to easy to learn how to play the game, it really opened up. And I really enjoyed the story and presentation of the game. It just felt a lot more polished than most arcade-style games at the time that traditionally would just give you a snippet of story and off you go. As a result, I'm closing out the 2022 review schedule on a high note and giving Bimini Run 3 stars. I know there's some people out there that don't care for it, and once you get good at it, you can probably finish it relatively quickly. But for me, and keeping the context that this was essentially an indie studio effort from very early on in the Genesis lifespan, I think it's a solid effort that should be recognized as being in the above-average portion of the Genesis library in 1990.
Okay, and that was Bimini Run for the Genesis. I'm really glad that Bimini Run didn't end up being the game I expected. And I really don't know why I thought it was going to be a vertical shooter in a boat. Maybe at some point I saw a screenshot from a different game in an advertisement and I just incorrectly put 2 and 2 together and got 5. Who knows? And I'm sure if the game was done well, that would have been cool too, but I'm happy with Bimini Run being exactly what it is, and I really wish that Nuvision had hung around for a bit because this is a game that certainly could have gotten even better with a sequel. I wouldn't go so far necessarily as to call it a hidden gem like Decap Attack or Gauntlet 4 that you really need to have in your collection, but it's definitely above average, and if you like action titles, it's worth a look. Next week on Zilog and Moto, there's no review. No, instead I'm closing out Season 4 and the year 2022 with one of my favorite videos of the year, my annual Year in Review episode, where I look back at the games I reviewed this year and hand out some awards for some highlights and lowlights for best and worst of the year. And it will be time for the top 10 and bottom 10 games that I've looked at in 181 episodes here on the channel. I hope you come back and check it out, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone, and if you celebrate a holiday, that's cool too. There's room for all of us on Zilog and Moto. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 181. If you like what you saw here today and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.